So we're in the book of Revelation, the apocalypse. That comes from the Greek word apocalypsis.
It's time to change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of Revelation. So grab your Bible. We'll be starting in chapter 1.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go.
So we're in the book of Revelation, the apocalypse. That comes from the Greek word apocalypsis. In our culture, we often think of the four men of the apocalypse, the four horsemen, or we might think of the movie Apocalypse Now, that it's a time of chaos and catastrophe. Very, very scary. And we identify this word with the end times and the last days, where everything is out of control. But the word apocalypse means the unveiling. It's the Greek word apo, which means away from, and then calypso, which means covering. So what it means is the taking away from the covering, the unveiling or revealing, like the word revelation. And so when I think of unveiling, I think of the dance of 1,000 veils, because I grew up in the 60s and they had these movies with belly dancers and they would have this risque dance and they would remove these 1,000 veils. But this is more like the taking off of a tarp or a covering from like a car, revealing the car underneath and bringing that car into the light for everybody to see. And so to the believer, the apocalypse will only be an unveiling. But to the unbeliever, it'll be very catastrophic and it'll be a time of a lot of chaos. And so now you have to think, well, what is this book revealing? And you kind of would think, well, it's revealing a lot. It's revealing the Antichrist and the kings and their kingdoms and Mystery Babylon and the beast and the false prophet. All these crazy things that are gonna come into our future. That's what it's revealing. And that's all true. It does reveal all these prophetic and futuristic events, also all these judgments of God. But if that's all you got out of this book, you would be missing the whole intent of the book, because it's Jesus Christ who is the object of this book, and it's him who the book is revealing. And so what we're going to have here is this private showing of the real glorified Jesus Christ in heaven, and we're going to see his relationship to our future in heaven, and that's what's going to be revealed to us. God's sovereign purposes in this world. Or basically, you can think of it, it's going to reveal to us the end of the story. So this book is kind of like a spoiler alert, where you're watching a movie and someone comes and they tell you the ending, because that's what we're seeing here. We're going to see the ending. And if this was a movie, it would be very, very uncool to do this. But with this story, it's a blessing, because it's going to keep us from freaking out and not knowing what's going on when we see all these things happening around us, because we do live in the last days. But now we know how the story ends. Okay. And so now this revelation, it wasn't given to the world, because you can read it here where it starts. It says, this is the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants. So God gave this revelation to Jesus Christ to show us about the things which must shortly take place. And so this book, it's predictive prophecy. And you have to realize that this book has been out for about 2,000 years, and it still says it's going to shortly take place. So the Bible's term for shortly is a little bit different than how we think of shortly. But the Greek word that's translated shortly here is the word takai. And that's where we get our word for tachometer. And so it means speed. So it means quickly and suddenly. So it's not so much that it's going to happen shortly, but that when it does happen, it's going to be fast. It's going to be quick. It's going to be like a tachometer revving up. And so there's a lot of people, and they think this book, that it's not easily understandable, and that it's a closed book, like the book of Daniel. We know that God told Daniel to shut up the word and to seal up the book, and you can read that in Daniel chapter 8, verse 28. And Daniel's vision was closed because that vision was for a later generation. It wasn't for his generation, but it was actually for our generation. But this is not a closed book. This is an open book because God, he wants to reveal these things to us. So these things aren't hidden because these are the things for us to know, because these things are at hand and they will be happening shortly. But because of all the symbolism used, a lot of people think that this book is basically not understandable. And that in this revelation, that any symbol can mean just about anything you want it to mean. And if you've been around for a while, you've probably heard people's imaginations just running wild with this text, that everything in here is a symbol for something else. Like, well, that means tanks, and that means machine guns, and that's a nuclear bomb. But that's not true here. John does not use a lot of symbolism just for the sake of symbolism. What he's talking about are things that are real, and these are real, actual things that relate to real things. 500 of these symbols in the book of Revelation, they're actually described and they're found in the Old Testament. But sometimes here, John, he's just using this symbolic language to give us a greater visual picture. Where John, he could have just said, a world leader. But instead, John says, he's a beast. Or he could have described the Babylonian false religious beliefs as just Babylon the Great. But John calls this false religion, he says, it's the great whore who rides the beast. And so John uses this type of symbolism, and in this case, he does it to contrast between Babylon's whorish beliefs to the church's pure beliefs in calling the church a bride. And so some of these symbols, they're found in the Old Testament. And some of these symbols, they're explained right here in the text, either by Jesus or by an angel. But some of these symbols are never explained, and we just kind of have to wonder what they mean. But a lot of what John is describing here is just what he sees. It was just the only way that he could describe it. He could only describe it in the symbolic language. But all he was doing was describing what was unfolding right in front of him as he saw it. And so it was the only language he knew, though it's very vivid language, like things like a woman being drunk with the blood of the saints. And so we're told that this revelation of Jesus Christ was given to Jesus by God, and then it was sent by his angel to his servant John. Okay, so this is the Apostle John. So he's the one we know. He's the one who wrote the Gospel of John, and he also wrote the letters, the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. So this is one of Zebedee's sons. This is one of the sons of thunder. And he's the one who called himself the disciple whom Jesus loved. And now this John, he's an old man, and he's the last surviving apostle. Because this book was written in about 96 AD, and John, he's getting close to being about 100 years old. And it's been about 60 years since John has seen Jesus, and all the other apostles, they've died. They've all been martyred. The first of them was his brother James, and he was beheaded. And then there was Matthias, and he'd been tied down, and he'd been eaten by vultures. And then there was Thaddeus, who was shot full of arrows as he was being crucified. And then there was Nathanael, who was skinned alive before he was crucified. And then there was Philip, who was hanged, and Andrew was crucified. Matthew was beheaded. James Alphaeus, he was thrown off the roof of the temple. Thomas, he had been impaled on a large spike. And then there was Simon the Zealot, who was sawn into pieces. And then you'd have Mark, who is the writer of the Gospel of Mark. Well, he'd been dragged behind a chariot until dead. And then Luke, the writer of the Gospel of Luke, he had also been crucified. And then we know that Paul, the apostle, he had been beheaded. And Peter, he was crucified upside down beside his wife. And so here we have John, he's lost all the people he knew back in the day. And he's the last disciple who has seen the risen Christ. And now all the others that he knew, they've all gone on to glory. And so now you have John, and he's left with this new generation of believers. And all of this new generation, none of them are eyewitnesses. And he's partaking with them this ongoing persecution from the Roman Empire. And this persecution, it started with the Emperor Nero, who really came from this really messed up home where his mother hated Nero's father. And so Nero's mother, she poisoned him, but she poisoned him by sending Nero in, who was just a little boy of 9 years old, with a plate of poisoned vegetables. And so Nero, he saw his dad die right in front of him. But then, since that time as a boy, he starts this killing streak. And from this very young age, he started killing friends when they disagreed with him. And then he killed 3 of his wives, and then he killed his own mother. And all of that happened before he was 19 years old. And then by 31, Nero, he slit his own throat, but he didn't die. So this is the same Nero who had been witnessed to by the Apostle Paul twice. And he hated Christians so much that by 68 AD, it's estimated that he had killed over 3 million Christians. And he killed them just for entertainment. He did it by tying them up in animal skins and to be killed by other beasts. And then he burned them alive, put tar on them, and he'd light them up in his garden, and then he'd ride through his garden naked. And so this Nero, he died in 69 AD. And he was replaced by Titus Vespasian. And this is that Titus that had destroyed the temple in Jerusalem and actually destroyed the city of Jerusalem, which happened in 70 AD. But this Titus and this emperor, he was a little kinder to the Christians. And then he was replaced by his son, who was Titus Jr., because he named him after himself. He was also another Titus. But he only lived for about 2 years. And then he was replaced by his younger brother, Domitian. Now, Domitian, he hated Christians even more than Nero did. Nero, he only persecuted the Christians in Rome, but Domitian, he persecuted them throughout the whole Roman Empire. And this Domitian, what he did is he claimed to be God and demanded the people to say, Caesar is Lord, instead of Jesus is Lord. And so a lot of Jews and a lot of Christians, they died because they couldn't say that. They couldn't say Domitian was Lord. And now, with Jerusalem being gone, the Apostle John, he takes Mary, which was Jesus' mother, and he went up to Ephesus, which is in Turkey, and he became the elder in the church of Ephesus. And so John, he's overlooking all the churches in Western Asia. And Domitian, he heard that John was there, and he wanted to kill John because he hated Christians that much. And so he wanted John's death to be special, and he wanted it to be a slow death, and he wanted it to be more torturous than any of the others he was killing. And so it was suggested to Domitian to boil John in oil. And so he did. And the crowd, it went wild. And John, he just stood there in the boiling oil, and he began to pray. And then all the crowd settled down, and John began to worship, and he began to sing songs until Domitian couldn't stand it anymore. And that's when Domitian had John banished to the island of Patmos, where he saw this revelation. So here, where John is bearing witness to the word of God and to the testimony of Jesus Christ, and it says to the things he saw. So John here, he knows that he is writing scripture. And then John, he reveals to us this promise of a blessing to those who read it. And here, the word here where it says reading, it actually means to read out loud. because this book would have been read out loud in a public meeting. Because, of course, the people, they wouldn't have had their own copy of the book, this was actually a scroll, and all of it had to have been copied by hand. So this book would have been copied and it would have been sent to all 7 of these churches. And these churches were an actual 7 physical churches. That is not symbolism. And so this would have been read to them. And then on each copy, it would have had a special message written to each one of these churches. And so now we read here, and there's a promise of a blessing to the one who reads this book. And so here, in this place, that's going to be me. But then there's a promise of a blessing to those who hear the words of this book. And so that means you guys. And there is one condition, though, for this blessing. The condition is that you have to keep the words and the things that are written in it. But it doesn't say to get this blessing that we have to understand everything it says. We don't have to understand it all. And this is the only book in the Bible that actually promises a blessing to the reader by reading it. But when you do get to the end of this book and you get to chapter 22, which is the last chapter, you'll read there in verse 18 that there's also a curse for those who hear this book and won't obey it. And it says that there's this curse to anyone who hears this book and he adds to it, that they will receive all the plagues that are written in this book, and they will lose their part in the book of life. So although there's a blessing, we need to be very careful not to add our own thoughts of what we think things mean. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't read it. And nowadays, there's a lot of churches, they just skip over this book. And they just skip over all predictive prophecy. And they're missing out on this blessing because those things are our great hope. But I don't know if this next view that we're going to talk about of adding to the book or taking away from it is going to apply here. But there are 4 different views on interpreting the book of Revelation. The first view is called the preterist view. And the preterists, they only believe that this prophecy of the Revelation, it only deals with the church during John's day. That this revelation is not about the future, and it's not a book of predictive prophecy, and it's not dealing with future events. That John here, he's only describing current events that are happening in his own time. That this revelation is just a criticism of the Roman government. So those who hold this view, they believe that everything in this book has already been fulfilled. They don't view this book of being literal at all. And this preterist view or amillennialist view, they were all started by the Roman Catholic Church. And that was when they decided that they wanted to have the kingdom here on earth and that their priesthood would be the priesthood and that they would control the earth. In amillennialism, all that means is that they don't believe in a real 1,000-year reign of Christ on the earth. They'll actually tell you that we're already in that 1,000-year period right now. To be honest with you, I don't know how they could ever come up with that because I don't know how they could believe that because it doesn't look to me like Satan has been bound at all. And I really don't see the lions laying down with the lambs. So I don't know how they get their stuff. But then there's a second view, and this is called the historic view. And the historic view, it only believes that the book of Revelation, that it only predicts the future of the church and the church age. And that the Revelation, it's not predictive prophecy about the end times or the last days. And this was a very popular view during the Protestant Reformation, where they would do things like call the beast that's in chapter 13, they would call him the Catholic Post. And so they had a very, very anti-Catholic view of the book of Revelation. And this was a very popular view among the reformers like Wycliffe, Knox, Tyndale, Martin Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, Wesley, Edwards, Whitefield, and Finley. But this view is not popular anymore. And it's just my opinion, but I think what their problem was, and the reason that they couldn't see this book as predictive prophecy is because they couldn't see these future events because they couldn't see it without Israel being a nation. And when they looked at the world and they looked at the governments that were ruling and how things were, they just couldn't make sense of this. I believe that if they lived during our times, they would view this book totally differently than they did in their times. I think it just didn't make sense to them, and so they did the best they could, and they tried to figure it out for themselves. Now, the third view is called the poetic view, and that's where they just believe that the book of Revelation is filled with all these word pictures, and that these word pictures were just to encourage the persecuted saints during John's era, that this book is neither literal or historic. It just has a personal meaning to the original people who John was writing it to. And then there's the fourth view, which is our view, which is the futuristic view. And that's when you get to chapter 4 of the Revelation, that this book deals directly with the end times and the return of Jesus. And many people will tell you, well, that's not the original view. This is not the traditional view. But what they're saying isn't true, because this was the view of the apostles and the early church fathers. This view was taught for 250 years after Jesus' resurrection. They taught the book of Revelation as if it was literal, that all of these events are going to happen all in the future. And so this was taught by the early church fathers. It was taught by Irenaeus, who lived in 130 AD, Justin Martyr and Polycarp. And Justin Martyr, he talks about the apostle John, that he was somebody that lived among them, and that he actually told them that they would reign with Christ for 1,000 years, and then the final judgment would take place. And then Tertullian, he said in his writing that there was a kingdom that is promised us in earth in a different existence after the resurrection, and it will last for 1,000 years. And so all the early church fathers who were leaders of the church after the time of the apostle, they all taught this futuristic view that they called Chilianism, and that with the 1,000-year millennium, at that time, it was actually considered to be part of the apostles' doctrine. There was only one church father who didn't hold this view, and that was Origen, who actually rejected the book of Revelation from being scripture. Okay, so now we look in our text, in John, he identifies himself, and he begins to greet these 7 churches in Asia. And when we think of Asia, we think of places like China and Japan, but this is Western Asia. So this is what we would call Asia Minor. And all of these 7 churches were real churches that were located in the country that we would call modern-day Turkey. And the church of Ephesus is one of these churches, and that's where John, where he had been an elder before he was banished to the island of Patmos. So at one time, John was the overseer of all these churches himself. And you have to realize there were a lot more than 7 churches in Asia at this time. But these 7 churches were picked because what some people think, because of what they were going through at that time. And that by using these 7 churches, that it gives us an outline of all of church history throughout all the eras of the church, all the way up into our modern times. And you're going to realize as we go through Revelation that the number 7 is a very significant number in this book.
You need to change your world. You need to let it go.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, you can still make it to church today. And join us at 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,